and welcome to another session of, as promised, a video for task 1. Oh, you might not be able to see me today. Let me just put myself into view. There you go. You can see me now. Let me make myself a little bit smaller as well so that I'm not taking up too much room. Okay, so as promised, I'm going to do another little video for you regarding task 1. So in the IELTS academic or even general exam, you might not necessarily get a bar chart or a line graph like we did last session. You may get a processes task, which basically means you'll get a diagram and they'll ask you how what's happening in each of the processes in the diagram. So I'm going to show you quite a complicated one today, but I think it's good to start off with something complicated because then that way you'll have a fair idea of what type of things to expect, and if you do get something complicated in the exam, you won't worry too much about it. So let's have a look at what our objectives are for today. So today we're going to write a task 1 processes essay using a range of passive structures and relative clauses, and we're going to identify the key areas in a process, because ultimately in all of the IELTS exams, ultimately it's that you can identify the key areas. In all of the task 1s, it's that you identify the key areas in a process. Like I said in my last video, you can't possibly write down every single point because A, you don't have enough time, and B, you don't have enough word count either. So again, this is another 150 word essay, and it should have a beginning, a middle and an end. So an introduction, a main body and a conclusion. And as long as you stick to that format, you should be okay. And it's really important that you give an overview of what the actual process is about. So I'm going to show you today's task. Are you excited? It's the carbon cycle. Okay, and you're looking at it. And the first time I looked at it, I was like, oh my goodness, that's quite a lot of things. There are a lot of arrows pointing here, pointing this way, pointing that way. There are many different lines, and I can understand that in a 20-minute time frame, people could get really, really nervous about doing this. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through it nice and slowly so that you can try and familiarize yourself with what the most or the key features of this are. So it says the diagram below shows the carbon process. Describe the process, highlighting the main features and making comparisons where relevant. Again, let's go back to this question here. Comparisons where relevant. It means if you should be making comparisons, make them. If you shouldn't, don't, because it might not be relevant. If it is though, please do and make those comparisons. Good idea. Okay, so let's have a look at this. This is the carbon cycle. There's a lot of information there, but one thing that we can see is, if we have a look at the key here, it says carbon cycle product. So we can see that there are clearly how many boxes? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are clearly 7 boxes. So these illustrates the carbon cycle products. So our introduction may be something like this. The illustration depicts the carbon cycle and the parts all living and non-living elements play in this. At first glance, and in an overview, we can see that there are 7 carbon cycle products created within the entire cycle. So that's just a very simple introduction. It's clear. The examiner will know that you can see what's going on here. You can see what's going on in the actual diagram itself. You've read the key, because all those little things, if you have a key, don't ignore it. It's there for a reason. So the examiner knows that you can see all these little elements within the actual diagram. Okay, you could also say it is evident on first glance that all elements of the cycle, or all parts of the cycle, return back to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Okay, so that could be part of your introduction. You could write it like that, but it's really, really important that you say in your introduction what's going on, and it's important to have an introduction. So that's one of the key elements of this. Okay, so then we're going to have a look at some of the key features within this diagram here. One way in which to start this is to sequence it by saying to begin with. So for me, I would start with to begin with, because I think it's really important in your exam, both your speaking and your writing, that you sequence. Only because it helps you to stay on track of what you want to say. So in your planning stage, those couple of minutes before you actually start writing, you should think about in what sequence you're going to put things. And sometimes it's easier to write it like that as well. So for me, I've put to begin with, carbon dioxide can be dissolved in rain and soil, which results in carbon dioxide being dissolved in sea water. You don't always have to use the same word dissolved. You can use a different word. For example, penetrates the seawater. For example, you could use different words, which is much better for you to do. Don't always use the same words. So we've got to begin with, carbon dioxide can be dissolved in rain and soil, which results in carbon dioxide penetrating sea water, for example. Okay, so that's the first part of my carbon cycle, as you can see here. I've mentioned that's my first part. Then I'll move on to the second part, and I said on account of this, it is absorbed by organisms and 2 types of carbon is released. So as you can see here, 2 types of carbon. Number 1, carbon in soft parts. Number 2, calcium carbonate in hard parts. Okay, so that's just the first part of what I've written. And then I put, this is then turned into carbon in coal, natural gas, carbon in oil, and CO2 in limestone. So I'm not explaining everything. So I'm not explaining the burial and the decomposition in rock sequences. I'm not talking about the burial amid the rock formations. I'm just telling you this here, carbon in marine animals and plants turns into carbon in coal and natural gas, carbon in oil, and carbon in limestone. So I'm making it quite clear that I'm talking about the main features. You don't have to talk about these little features here. Unless you want to and you have enough time. Again, you have to remember time has to be of the essence, and you should really just focus on the main features. Okay, and then if I move on, I've got which is then released into the environment, enabling the process of photosynthesis. So here I've got which is then released. So I'm talking about this, which is then released into the environment. So you could write atmosphere if you wanted to, but remember it's really useful to use a range of synonyms. Examiners like to see synonyms. Examiners like to see your ability with the language. This is ultimately what they are looking for. And then what did I put? I put carbon is then released into the environment and enables the process of photosynthesis. Okay, so it enables the process of photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere enables the process of photosynthesis. And then I put after that, or subsequently, the consumption of the photosynthesized plants by the land animals absorb the CO2 as a result of their absorb the CO2. Here we go. So subsequently land animals consume the photosynthesized plants and animals, and as a result, so that's what they do. And then I put my second sentence would be, as a result of their death and excretion, carbon dioxide is released into the soil and gives rise to more CO2 in the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide is then released back into the soil here, which then turns into this, which starts the carbon process, which starts the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere again. So as you can see, this process is pretty much, everything comes back to that same one part. So that would be the main body of my essay. As you can see, I didn't mention every single thing. I didn't mention weathering. I didn't mention combustion. However, if you want to, you can do. For me personally, I just wanted to mention the main features, and I think that's sufficient enough. And also, I'll talk to you a little bit more later on about the passive structure that I used and which phrases that I used, because that's really, really important in this. It's really important in this processes essay that you engage with the passive structure as well. And then I would conclude. So for me, I would say it is clear to see from this process that both plants, animals, and the natural world play a vital role in the carbon cycle. They all rely on one another to release CO2 into the atmosphere, and ultimately they all come back. CO2 is then ultimately goes back through them again and again and again, which you can use as a conclusion. It is perfectly sufficient to do so. Again, with something like this, with the processes diagram, it's really important that you do use passive structures, because you can't always show the examiner in a diagram like this past perfect or present perfect or anything like that. You can't show them those type of structures usually, unless you're very clever, but usually you can't. So it's really important that you use passive structures for this, and you use relative clauses. So let's have a little look. Let me show you a little look about the type of phrases that we used for this. So here we go. The type of phrases which we used, see that? Relative clause which we used. So which results in, on account of this, due to, as a result of this, and gives rise to. I also said subsequently again, and I said to begin with, and I said subsequently. Again, you can use those starters, sequencing starters, to help you to write your essay. And these are some of the passive structures that I use. Be dissolved, being dissolved, absorbed by, is released into. Why is it important to use passive? Again, like as I said before, you can't always use the perfect structures in this, and it's not possible. So, it's important that you show the examiner that you are aware of how to use the passive structure. You can always use the perfect structures when you come to writing task 2. So, for example, be dissolved, being dissolved, absorbed by, is released into. I also used some relative clauses, which again act as connectors for sentences. And why are they important? Because here I haven't used things like however, moreover, furthermore. I just didn't use them. So I'm using those relative clauses as connectors, which is also very, very important to do. So I'm going to show you here a little practice for using relative clauses. So if we have a look at number 1, I've done it for you as an example, but then 2, 3, and 4 you can do yourself, I'm sure. Okay, so number 1 says, there is carbon, it is dissolved in seawater. With a relative clause, I would say there is carbon which is dissolved in seawater. So I'm using which as my relative clause, or my relative pronoun, to join my 2 clauses together. Then you've got, there is carbon, it is in land animals. There are land animals, they die and excrete. And there is carbon in limestone. This is weathered over time. Again, you try, you have a little practice and see whether or not you can use the correct relative clauses. Send me a message, Facebook, anything you like, and let me know what you think. And if you need a little bit more help, ask me questions. I'm ready to answer. I'm ready to answer and give you a little bit of a helping hand in your processes essay. So again, go over this session, have a look, make sure you understand exactly the type of things processes require. But if you stick to passives, if you stick to introduction, main body and a conclusion, if you stick to passives and relative clauses, that should show the examiner enough of your understanding. And remember, this is an overview of the carbon cycle. I can't possibly write about every single part of the carbon cycle. I just would not have the time in the IELTS exam to do that. So I'll see you next time. I may do a little lesson, a little session on relative clauses and possibly even the passive actually. That might be quite nice. So I'll do a little session on the passive next time actually. And then we can move on to task 2 of the writing exam, and let me know what you think and let me know how this works out for you. Have a lovely week. The weather is not so great here anymore. It was sunny this morning and now it's raining. So enjoy the rest of your week and happy studying. Take care. Bye.